What if, one day, you and your children were awoken by a bang on the door? What if your children were suddenly taken into care? What if the same thing was happening to your neighbours, all because a local kid had told tales about ghosts? And now you're being accused of worshipping the devil. What if accusations like these appear again and again and again, all across Britain, over the course of 3 decades, from Greater Manchester to the Highlands to the wealthy suburbs of London?
Some social workers were on a crusade.
They were always afraid that they were going to have someone, firebomb them.
People are convinced that Satan is taking over.
Where do they get this information from that I am Satan?
This is a story of a nightmare you don't wake up from. It's the story of conspiracy, kidnap, and horror. It's the story of the satanic panic that gripped Britain. And it's not over yet.
The Langley estate was a huge, sprawling council estate, I think dating back to the 1950s, developed specifically to house people who had come out of the slum clearances. It was a tough estate. It's a really hard, poor part of Manchester.
It has a bad reputation, and the presence of the authorities on the estate is not unusual.
Along with that poverty came criminality, lots of drugs, criminal gangs, knife crime, low educational achievement, literacy was poor. So there was always something going on the Langley estate.
But on the 29th of March, something far darker begins to unfold.
I think it was a Thursday or Friday, the phone went, and there was quite a hesitant man on the other end of the line, and he said that he needed some help. His kids had been taken into care.
4 children from Langley have been torn from their parents and placed into care. And the reason sounds like something out of a nightmare.
Obviously, any journalist asks the next question, which is why? And he said, quite boldly, they say we are witches.
Then a young reporter on a local newspaper, Jane, knows that this is a story unlike anything she has heard before.
I immediately told my editor, got in the car, wanted to meet up with this couple face to face. And what I found actually was quite a neat, semi-detached house, neatly dressed couple who were quite wary, but were holding it together. They were desperate for help. And despite calling on their MPs, despite calling on local councillors, they felt they'd come to a dead end. The newspaper had just landed a day before. Obviously, their thought processes were, perhaps the newspaper can help us. We sat down, we had a chat, and they described the most astonishing story of them being accused of subjecting their children to ritualistic, satanic abuse. That took the form of taking these children up into kind of loft spaces, putting them in cages, getting them to make wooden crosses and burn them.
They're the first of many to be taken in similar circumstances. But where are these outlandish accusations coming from? And how do so many children become embroiled? The story begins a few months earlier, when social workers had been alerted to the unusual behaviour of a young boy.
Towards the end of 1989, there's a 6-year-old boy who's apparently exhibiting signs of disturbed behaviour, and some teachers at his school express some concern. They speak to his mum, who's very cooperative, and it results in a referral to social services.
Months later, following the intervention by his school, the boy and his sister are questioned by social workers. According to the brief notes made after the interview, which was not videoed, the boy makes a series of seemingly astonishing statements.
He kept talking about ghosts and being locked up and other kind of alarming, concerning things. Apparently the boy had said that he'd been fed a drink that made him feel like he could fly. I mean, obviously that had created suspicions that he was somehow being drugged.
His sister described similar scenarios, although she says they happened in her dreams. But, crucially, both children identify other kids from the neighbourhood as being present during these events.
What they concluded from those initial interviews was that these children were involved in satanic ritual abuse, and it followed from that that other children that they were in contact with were also likely to be involved in that.
Over the next couple of months, the children are interviewed numerous times. By May 1990, Jane is about to break the story.
We published our first story on the 11th of May. We were going to do a follow-up story in our other newspaper on the 17th of May.
The world is about to find out what has been happening on the Langley estate. But then, publication is brought to a halt.
Council moved pretty swiftly to clamp it down.
Court injunctions are put in place to ensure that nothing is made public, including the identity of the children, their family, and the reason for their removal.
There were legal warnings even to councillors, even to the elected body, whose job it was to represent their constituents, that they should not be talking about it. The injunction prevented us from talking about the case for several months.
Then, on the 14th of June 1990, off the back of the interviews, social services go into overdrive. They carry out 3 dawn raids on houses on the Langley estate. Social workers and police burst into the families' homes while many of the children are still asleep. Still in their pyjamas, they are torn from their beds, whilst their confused and horrified parents watch on, powerless, with no idea what is happening. In total, 12 more children are taken into care, whilst their desperate parents wonder if they'll ever see their children again. It's the summer of 1990, and 15 children from the Langley estate have been taken away from their families and placed into care. One of the most shocking aspects of the case is that the kids were removed from their homes purely on the strength of the testimony from 2 young children.
So where a child's testimony implicates other children, possibly I'd expect to happen is that it would be an inquiry into each of those children in turn. People just rushed in and took away a child without formally investigating the case.
Based on the children's statement, members of Rochdale Social Services have become convinced they are uncovering a widespread case of what is known as Satanic Ritual Abuse, or SRA. Claims of SRA, the belief that a network of devil worshippers are invading and corrupting society, had become prevalent in the US over the previous decade. It quickly became the perceived cause of what 1980s America considered society's ills. From heavy metal music...
Where do they get this information from that I am Satan?
...to pornography, to child abuse. By the mid-80s, it had morphed into a full-blown moral panic, and people from all walks of society were convinced that horrific cases of child abuse were being practiced by Satanists.
It was being talked about, there were conferences about it, it was in the literature.
By the early 90s, that fear was beginning to spread across the globe, and had implanted itself well and truly in the establishment.
By the late 80s and early 90s, there's been a clear transfer of these ideas across the Atlantic. It particularly comes in through the police and child psychologists. But the child psychologists are also advising child protection agencies.
The social workers in Rochdale who became involved in this case had read some of that literature, so believed that they had information and understanding about it.
The scale of the moral panic was so large that even Westminster got involved. Jean Lafontaine was commissioned by the government to conduct a wide-ranging study.
People who are convinced that Satan is taking over Christian civilization, the millennium is approaching, so that they feel that things are going to deteriorate.
I think there were some social workers who were so confident that it was going to be satanic abuse. They were on a crusade, and these children were going to help them on the crusade, and therefore you must make them say the things that they could tell everybody and use on the crusade.
Many believed that the Satanic Panic, as it had become known, had taken hold of Rochdale social services and was influencing decision-making all the way to the top.
If you've got children talking in that way, then there are obviously a number of possibilities. One is that they could be describing something that's real. They could equally be describing something that they've seen in a film or on the TV. Equally, they could be describing something that's simply a fantasy. And you've got to consider all of those possibilities. And I think the problem here was that the social workers were going into this with a preconceived idea of what they were looking for, a preconceived notion that satanic ritual abuse was happening and that they had to uncover it.
Quickly, we realised that this was something that was going on in social services in terms of what they thought they were finding.
While the social workers may have been convinced they were onto a satanic ritual abuse ring, the family of the first boy, whose statement triggered the slew of dawn raids, have more innocuous explanations for their son's brutal descriptions.
Their story was very, very different. Their story was one of a small boy, 6 years old, who lived in kind of a family in a wider friendship group, and both the boy and his siblings and their wider friends often were permitted to watch what we might call now video nasties, but actually they were just horror movies.
From my understanding of the details of the case, family one claimed they had ghosts in the house. They got a priest to come and bless the house, and then they said the ghosts had gone. Now, this experience in real time is much more influential than anything they would see on a screen, and it would become ingrained in the family story. So it really has no surprise to me that you've got the daughter dreaming of ghosts and the little boy thinking they're real, given that they had this early family experience.
Despite these explanations, social workers are convinced that when the children were describing horror stories, they were in fact reporting instances of SRA. By this point, 12 children, all named by the first two children, have been removed from their homes against their will.
They've been taken away very suddenly from their families, subjected to highly intimate, intrusive medical examinations. They had no sense of when they were going to be returned to their families. They had no real sense of why they were there at all.
Social services begin to interview the children, but from the start, mistakes are made.
There are a number of guidelines that you have to follow when you're deciding how to interview a child in those very, very difficult and potentially very distressing circumstances. And it was clear that those guidelines had not been followed.
When experts subsequently examined the videos, they were alarmed by what they saw.
Having seen some of the examples of the videos from the Rochdale case, it's very concerning in many respects. The first is the children. Some of the children are obviously distressed and are unable to engage in any interview, and yet the interviewer persists. The actual interview technique itself is extremely poor. It's closed questions where a suggestion is made, and then the child has to answer yes or no.
Does not like them. They do horrid things. Oh. No.
And I think that some of the main examples of that is where she actually says the ghost is a bad person. Well, what ghost? Who said the ghost exists? So the style of questioning is suggestive, closed, and abusive.
And who got you in the cage? Oh, do you know, I think this ghost is really very naughty.
The social workers are convinced that when the children reference ghosts, the ghosts are actually their abusers. And, as the recordings show, this is a line of questioning they persist with, even when the children contradict them.
Can you tell me a little bit more about the ghost that you were frightened of?
What ghost?
When we were talking about the ghost that was at house, that was the ghost that frightened you, wasn't it? Is that right?
I didn't see that ghost.
You didn't see that ghost. So you were frightened because told you it was in their house.
Despite the children's distress, the interviews continue unabated.
In one particular videotape, a 6-year-old girl is extremely distressed and wants to see her brother.
What?
We've got to try it. That's what you want to know. Talk. If you stop crying, then we can talk about you going.
The social worker completely ignores her and continues on for 17 minutes or more, and then even goes as far as to say, if you give me some information, we can take you back, which is bribery, actually. That child's interview should have stopped immediately, allowed the child to calm down, and then if they wanted to see their brother and their brother was there, then that should have been allowed.
They wanted to get out of the situation as quickly as they could. They didn't understand what the real purpose of the questioning was. But one of the things that children will do in that situation is they will look for a steer from the adults who are there as to what's wanted of them, what's required of them. And if the adult has a very preconceived idea of what they want the children to say, then the children will pick up on that and respond in that way. And I think that's part of what happened here.
Do you fly out of the window with the ghost? Or does you do? So do you do your spinning before you go out of the window then?
Many years after those interviews, when I worked with the children involved, who were now adults by this point, they told me about their experience of being interviewed. And they explained that at the time they were very traumatised.
By September 1990, 4 more children have been removed from their homes and interviewed by social services. Meanwhile, police have been conducting their own investigation.
So in cases like this, where you have very serious allegations of the abuse of children, you've got 2 types of legal proceedings going on. You've got the potential criminal proceedings, where somebody might be prosecuted for criminal offences if they're suspected of committing abuse. And you've also got family law proceedings, where the questions about whether a child should stay in care will be dealt with.
Police quickly realise that there isn't enough evidence to pursue a criminal case.
The police concluded after a period of investigation that there was no realistic prospect of convicting any of these parents for involvement in satanic ritual abuse or indeed any other type of abuse. And so they decided not to pursue the criminal angle.
But social services are undeterred.
Surely, if the police are telling you that they have found no evidence, that has to raise questions about whether or not they've got it right here. But they drove it, and they drove it more or less to the end.
In March 1991, a year after social services met with the little boy who set off this chain of events, Rochdale Council finally brings the case to the family court.
The local authority case was that these children had been involved in satanic ritual abuse, but they had to drop the sort of sexual allegation part of that because there was no evidence of sexual abuse. So they were effectively asserting that these kids were involved in satanic ritual abuse, but with no element of sexual abuse. The case that they tried to argue was that the children had been given hallucinogenic drugs, and that at least some of what the children were describing was the result of being given those drugs.
Social services are hoping for vindication, but they don't get it.
The judge heard all the evidence and concluded very clearly and unequivocally that none of them had been subject to satanic ritual abuse, and the result of that was that the vast majority of the children were able to go back home.
The judge found that numerous failings had been made by Rochdale Social Services, that 18 children had been taken away from their parents for nothing more than a made-up tale, and it would be years before all the children found their way home.
I think the fundamental criticism that the judge made was in relation to the way the children had been interviewed. One of the things that the social workers did is that even when the children were denying very clearly that, that in effect that this kind of abuse had taken place, the social workers were simply not prepared to accept that.
You might have some sympathy for those social workers who were just younger and less experienced, perhaps, who were caught up in all of this. But certainly you can't have any sympathy for Rochdale Social Services Department, that this went to the very top. This was a culture that came from the very top. At any point, the Director of Social Services could have said, enough. What is going on here? Where's the evidence? Where's the proper reporting?
I think many people will say, social workers are damned if they do and damned if they don't. And I have some sympathy for that view. Social workers do a very difficult job. We need social workers. We need good ones who do the job well. But I think that they can only do the job well if they learn the lessons of appalling cases like this.
In my experience over the past 30 years, the scapegoat for child protection has been social work. So it's a difficult job, because if anything goes wrong, it's not the GP, it's not the health visitor, it's not the police officer, it's the social worker that carries the can. And they are often the scapegoat in where child protection cases go wrong. So this must make their job very difficult and very stressful and anxious. So the social workers were doing the best they can, but I'm sure if they look back now, they'd realise it was very emotionally abusive.
On the 7th of March 1991, the families of the Langley estate get the judgment they want. But the satanic panic continues to have a grip on the nation. Around 600 miles away, on the Orkney Islands, another satanic panic nightmare is about to begin. In February 1991, just as the Rochdale abuse scandal is coming to a close, 600 miles away, another town is about to be rocked by the spectre of satanic ritual abuse.
It's a tolerant, decent community, and they're used to dealing with people from different cultures and different parts, and there's no intercommunal hostility or anything of that sort within Orkney at all. It's a very happy place. That's why this sort of event is just so extraordinary.
It's a crisp winter morning, and the usually tranquil capital of the Orkney Islands is abuzz with activity.
A large horde of people amassed in Kirkwell in the centre. I think there were 26 cars involved, 40 police officers. It was a massive military-style operation. It was synchronised so that they could burst their way in the early hours of the morning into several homes, and basically police and social workers, people just turned up without any warning, first thing in the morning, demanding to search the house and take the children.
By the afternoon, 4 family homes have been raided, 9 children forcibly removed from their loved ones and flown on a specially chartered flight hundreds of miles away to mainland Scotland.
I think they may have had a change of clothes, but pretty much it was the clothes they stood up in. They weren't allowed to take any sort of personal possessions or anything like that. They didn't have a clue where they were going. They were flown off the island.
Devastated parents are left confused and frightened. They don't know where their children are or when they'll see them again.
They really were totally bewildered as to what was going on. That first day, nobody really had a lot of information as to why the children had been taken away.
One of the things that the parents were told by the interim reporter was that all the children had been taken to foster care settings. That wasn't true. Oldest of the children, he was taken to a young offenders institution, which was as far from a foster placement as you can probably get.
So what led to these children being torn from their beds in the early hours? Like the Rochdale case, it begins with a statement made by a child to social services. And just like Rochdale, the authorities immediately suspect they are onto a case of ritualistic abuse. To protect their identity, none of the families involved in the case are named. Each one is referred to by a letter.
The W family was a large family, and there had been some physical and sexual abuse within that family with the father.
Since the father's conviction for child abuse in 1987, social services have become heavily involved with the family. And by 1990, 8 of the 15 children are in the care of the state. During interviews with social workers, some of the children make a series of disturbing allegations. Like Rochdale, the children mention others in their interviews, but this time, members of the wider community are implicated.
One of the kids starts telling stories about a local vicar.
The allegation was that in a quarry in South Ronaldsay, a circle of children was set up. The minister stood in the centre of the circle. The children all danced around him in a circle, and he had a big wooden crook, and he took it and pulled a child towards him from the ones dancing round, and then committed a sexual assault upon them.
As well as the vicar, names of local parents and kids are included in the W children's interviews. On the basis of the interviews, and convinced that they've discovered a satanic abuse ring, social workers trigger the dawn raids that result in 9 children being separated from their parents.
As far as we could determine, really very little further investigation was done.
A lot of people always think no smoke without fire, the authorities must know best, they wouldn't possibly do this unless they had extremely good grounds for doing so. So there's a wave of sort of feeling as, you know, the authorities couldn't get it this badly wrong, so there must therefore be quite a bit in that something really awful must have happened.
The distraught families immediately seek legal help, including Family H.
The morning that the children were taken away, I received a phone call, I think, at that stage. I think it was Mrs. H. She was aware that they were not the only family. By the end of that day, we'd put together enough of a picture to know that there were 4 families involved, and the other 2 families were represented by John Moyer, who worked in another local farm. Within a couple of days, we realised really we're just going to have to work together on this. What we did was to agree that for the duration, we'll set up another office, a separate office. We found premises. A couple of volunteers from the community came in and did secretarial work. Members of the community rallied round. People donated tables and chairs and desks, and we got that office up and running in 2 days. And that was largely down to voluntary effort.
Determined to return the children to their homes, the family's lawyers begin to try and prove that the allegations are nothing more than the figment of a child's imagination.
Our senior counsel suggested, and we were prepared to go along with the idea of taking out a full-page ad in the Orcadian, setting out precisely what the allegations were.
We took the wording and we put it in a full-page advert in the local paper. It basically said, you know, if anybody has witnessed any of this, please come forward. And nobody had witnessed any of this. That was the start, really, of our kind of publicity campaign.
South Ronaldsay in Orkney, off the northeast coast of Scotland, is a largely flat island.
The terrain where this is supposed to have happened, in a disused quarry in South Ronaldsay. All of South Ronaldsay is overlooked by other bits of South Ronaldsay and bits of public road. And you could not have conducted anything like what was alleged to have happened. without being seen or observed by somebody else.
I mean, for example, there's one family had a window that was completely overlooking the quarry and could see immediately what was going on there. So she would have seen everything instantly, but not only her, anyone in the neighbourhood would have seen and heard what was going on. And so the idea that you could keep it a secret or conduct some despicable satanic activity there is just quite ludicrous.
Despite many locals dismissing the idea of rituals in the quarry as nonsense, the social workers continued to pursue their case.
The children were all medically examined, and the results were all, negative. There was no evidence, no medical evidence at all of sexual abuse or any other kind of abuse for that matter. This was, I think, largely dismissed by the authorities who were kind of on a roll by this point, being, oh, well, it's too long after the fact, that it means nothing. But the medical evidence, there was no medical evidence of abuse.
With a complete lack of physical evidence, social workers are under pressure to get compelling testimony from the 9 kids named by the W children. They interview them, but like the Rochdale case, their questioning techniques are deeply flawed.
From what I can understand, the style of questioning was very inappropriate, very suggestive, and persistent to the point of emotionally abusing the child, that the child's denying, saying nothing happened to them. And I think that this sort of questioning provides no real truth or evidence to judge any case by. In terms of their use of drawings, the interviewer drew a circle, drew things around the circle, and then said to the child, does this mean anything to you? Well, that's ludicrous in terms of the use of drawings to provide corroborative evidence.
It's now over a month since 9 children were taken from their parents and placed in care facilities and a young offenders institute, miles away on the Scottish mainland. Social services still believe the children are in danger, and on the 3rd of April, a court hearing is held.
Well, this was a preliminary hearing at the Sheriff Court. The children weren't there, but the families were there and their legal representatives. And I think most of us expected Sheriff Kelby to give the reporters' side a bit of a hard time just on the way they had gone about things. Maybe suggest to them that they try and get their act together a bit more.
On the second day of the hearing, after reviewing the transcripts and tape recordings of the interviews, Judge Sheriff Kelby delivers surprising news.
What's called no competence, but essentially to dismiss the thing for jurisdictional reasons and stop the proceedings in their tracks.
He'd worked out this just does not stand up. He probably should have heard the evidence. But I think just the humanity in him took over, and he decided, really just as a matter of common sense and common humanity, that trumps the legal niceties of it, and he decided that the case should be thrown out there and then. Very brave thing for him to do.
Sheriff Kelby recommends the children be returned. With the judgment delivered, Alistair Bruce doesn't waste any time.
Like everyone around me, I was absolutely amazed. I left the court. I went straight to the council offices, and which are a few hundred yards away from the court. They agreed to see me. And I remember saying to them, well, you hired a plane to take these kids away 5 weeks ago. I think it would be good PR if you hired a plane to bring them back as soon as possible. And to their eternal credit, that's what they did.
On the 4th of April 1991, 5 weeks after being torn from their loved ones, the children of South Ronaldsay are returned.
I think a lot of people shared the joy of the outcome of it, because by then, everyone had realised it was wrong.
And that's something that I'll never forget, because myself and Alistair Bruce were some of the only people that were asked or invited to be in the sort of private area when the children were all reunited with their parents. And That still will bring a tear to my eye just thinking about it, because they were just so delighted and just squeezing and hugging, and it really was something quite beautiful to watch. Very emotional, very emotional. There was a piper and the whole thing. Great scrum of people and press, and just an outpouring of emotion, and it was quite something.
The moral panic around satanic ritual abuse that had been gripping the world had infiltrated local authorities on the small Scottish island. Children were separated from their parents and put under untold emotional distress, all because social services believed what turned out to be nothing more than a made-up horror story. Luckily, in the years that followed, the hysteria around SRA would gradually die down.
So by the end of the 1990s, the heat's really gone out of satanic ritual abuse. None of the court cases have led to lasting convictions. There's no body of evidence built up. Following 9/11, a lot of the attention moves entirely over to Islamic terrorists. Satanic ritual abuse really disappears as a concern.
But it wouldn't be long before the satanic panic would once again rear its head. And this time, the consequences would be even worse.
Okay, well, we'll talk about that. Remember what we're going to talk about at the moment. What we're going to talk about. Remember what we're talking about? What?
We're talking about what happened in the past.
It's 2014, and in Hampstead, London, 2 children are being interviewed by police. They claim they've been the victims of a satanic paedophile ring made up of local residents of the well-heeled suburb.
He comes to our school.
Oh, does he? And what does he do at the school?
He kills babies down.
Right.
We eat babies. We drink their blood.
This quiet and leafy suburb of London is now the centre of a very modern version of the satanic panics of the 90s. People are afraid to leave their homes for fear of being attacked by anti-SRA activists. Teachers face torrents of abuse at the school gates from protesters accusing them of practising witchcraft. And parents are afraid their children will be kidnapped by conspiracy theorists. It all begins after the breakup of 2 local parents.
My client, who was the father, had been trying to have contact to the 2 children, and which the mother had prevented.
Things take a sinister turn when Ella Draper, the mother, becomes involved with a new boyfriend, a man called Abraham Christie.
They go away on holiday in August of that year to Morocco, where he films the kids making allegations about them suffering satanic ritual abuse. When the family come back from Morocco, Abraham Christie contacts his brother-in-law, Jean-Clement, and tells him that the children of Ella Draper are being ritualistically abused. So they all go to Jean-Clement's house, where he makes an audio recording of this bizarre encounter, during which Abraham Christie, Ella Draper, and the kids put forward these incredible allegations. The really striking thing about this encounter is that Abraham Christie is coaching the children to make these allegations.
What the allegations consisted of was that babies were being sent from abroad, drugged. They were arriving in Hampstead. They were then having their throats cut. Their blood was being drunk. And the people involved, and predominantly orchestrated by their father, was then using the skin of the babies for shoes. The babies were being eaten, and so on. It was utterly outlandish. So the police quite properly investigated the allegations and video recorded those interviews with the children. And it was just astonishing to watch these children who, effectively were appearing completely brainwashed.
Well, there's a little pathway inside the church, so you have to go, you go in the church and then you go up the stairs again, and you go, and then there's this little path again, and then you go up the stairs, and then that's where they dance with the skulls on.
Abraham and Ella allege that there is an enormous satanic witch abuse network based in Hampstead, and at the heart of it is Ella Draper's ex, who commands a cult of around 175 Satanists who are engaged in trafficking babies from around the world to be sent to the local school, the local church, the McDonald's, the swimming pools, private houses of nearby parents to dismember babies, rape children, and drink their blood.
The police interview the children 3 times in total. On the 3rd time, they change their story, admitting the claims of satanic abuse are false.
By the 3rd encounter that they have with the police, what comes out is the startling revelation that Abraham Christie has been physically abusing the children.
The police investigation clears anyone mentioned in the videos of any wrongdoing. A family court judge makes similar conclusions.
And there a judge rules, having looked into the detail, that there was never any satanic ritual abuse going on in Hampstead, that there was not a shred of evidence to substantiate any of these outlandish claims, and that what was really at the heart of it was a domestic abuse situation where Abraham Christie was torturing, in the judge's words, Ella Draper's children.
But while the court case is in progress, for those implicated in the video, things are about to get much, much worse.
Ultimately, those police interviews and also a video recording of the children making similar allegations, which had been videoed by the mother's boyfriend, were then all uploaded onto the internet. What was also uploaded was personal contact details of everybody and anybody involved in the case.
These videos show children talking in incredible detail with great fluency about the horrific abuse that they have seen and endured. And if you weren't aware of the wider context, you could easily think these kids are telling the truth.
Although none of this is true, some people online do believe the kids are telling the truth. Very quickly, the video, as well as the list of names, explodes on the internet, racking up 4 million views in a matter of weeks.
As activists start appearing in the area, shouting that local parents are paedophiles, abusing them online, parents get so scared that they start having to install security systems, beefing up the protection around their own homes.
Activists post hastily filmed videos of themselves protesting on the streets of London. Again, despite the fact that police have dismissed the allegations as untrue, individuals calling themselves activists believe that they're exposing a case of SRA in wealthy suburban London and share the video widely. Anyone who questions them is met with extreme hostility, including a lifestyle blogger from Canada by the name of Karen Irving, who somehow finds herself embroiled in the madness.
One morning, sort of got up and realized that there was a particular post from about 2 years before that had something, like hundreds of hits, and we couldn't figure out why.
The post receiving this unexpected attention happened to feature a piece of artwork created by a friend of Karen's sister. By sheer coincidence, the artist lives in Hampstead and is on the list of alleged abusers.
People had come to our blog and had decided that this piece of art was clearly satanic, that the person who put it up was clearly satanic, which was,
What happens next ends up changing Karen's life forever.
My sister wrote a kind of sarcastic post saying something like, "Thank you, reptilian overlords, for sending us all of these amazing views. We really appreciate your attention." That just set off a complete firestorm of just really angry, furious comments. And that's when we started actually getting death threats.
Finding herself branded an SRA sympathiser, Karen begins looking into what was causing the hysteria and why an innocent post of a painting by an artist from Hampstead was suddenly getting so much vitriol.
So we began to look at the posts on the forum and realized that they were talking about 2 children who had allegedly disclosed satanic ritual abuse.
When she tracks down the videos, as well as the accompanying list of supposed satanic abusers, Karen is astonished by what she sees.
The first thing I noticed when I watched the videos was that the little girl in particular had bruises all over her face. They both looked stressed, and they were both, I want to say, excited, but not in a good way, just kind of like jittery.
Believing the contents of the video to be false, Karen begins to question the SRA narrative that had been created online.
When I first began commenting on some of the material on YouTube and in some of the discussions about what was going on, anytime I would make any kind of a comment that was even slightly, saying, well, maybe we should think about whether this is true, I'd get, dogpiled by, 100 different people.
But Karen wants to fight back for herself and the people of Hampstead, whose lives are being ruined by what she considers a malicious hoax.
I do not like the feeling of being bullied, and I do not like bullshit. And it was a nasty combination of the two.
Karen formed a group with others online. They started a blog called the Hoaxted Research Group, calling out the videos and the SRA hysteria that had taken hold in Hampstead as a hoax. As the blog accumulated views, the people of Hampstead started to reach out to her.
Their life had just become a living hell. They were always afraid that they were going to have someone firebomb them or bang on their door and, break it down or something, because their addresses were all published. I tried to say, well, we all have to do what we can to make this thing settle down so you can live your normal life and your kids can go back to being normal kids.
But the damage had already been done.
Activists continued to go to the area to hassle parents who they believed to be conspirators in a grand satanic ritual abuse ring.
A lot of the people who were making comments about the hoax were saying, we have to step in, we have to rescue these children.
I mean, certainly, so far as the ramifications of this case and the consequences of this case, the father and the children have lived with the threat of kidnap, and so far as the father is concerned, death. He has had death threats, and certainly my understanding from him is that there have actually been groups of people plotting to kidnap his children.
And in a separate case, this is exactly what happened next. It's 2014, and fear around satanic ritual abuse has resurfaced. In Hampstead, activists convinced that local residents are part of a satanic child trafficking ring are posting confrontational videos online. But the scandal is about to take an extreme turn. Amongst the activists who believe the stories is a man called Wilfred Wong. He's become known for his combative and accusatory online videos.
I've also met and spoken with Ella Draper at length. She is no doubt very credible. It is the most well-known SRA case in the UK, which is all the more reason why the UK authorities were trying so hard to cover it up. Because if they had to accept that the Hampstead case was true, that would have blown the lid off decades of denial and cover-up regarding SRA, claims that SRA does not exist, claims that SRA is a myth, would have gone down the drain if the Hampstead case had been investigated.
Wilfred Wong is very well known to the satanic ritual abuse activist world. He's commonly live streaming his views on SRA and how to prevent it. He's become a kind of counselling figure to a lot of people who claim to have been ritualistically abused.
But 6 years after the Hampstead case, he escalates from what some consider an SRA counsellor to something far more sinister.
He was contacted by a woman called Anka Hill, who told him that she believed a child was being abused in a ritual context by the child's father. They came up with quite an elaborate plan to essentially kidnap this child from the foster parents who were looking after it.
Together with Anka, Wilfred puts together a team to undertake the outlandish scheme to remove a child they believe is in danger from their foster home on the Welsh island of Anglesey.
So the plan, which was later described in court as a meticulous and sophisticated operation, had been in the works for some months, and the team had been surveilling the foster family.
So watching outside the school, establishing the family's routine.
They knew their movements, what time they went to school and came back, the layout of their house, and knew exactly the moment at which they'd be most vulnerable to striking.
So the day of the plan works like this, that they're going to do the kidnapping, liberation, call it what you will, and they're going to drive across the Menai Straits onto the mainland.
At around 4 p.m, they strike.
The teams are all in place. There's a snatch squad and a lookout crew who are keeping an eye out for police. The foster family is heading home from school.
As she pulls up to the house, Wilfred Wong and Anka Hill pull up in a car alongside. Wilfred Wong confronts the foster mother. Anka Hill attempts to take the child out of the car. The child's very distressed. The foster mother's doing everything she can to prevent this.
And there's a struggle as the child is being fought over by these two women. While this is going on, Wilfred Wong comes around to the foster mother and draws a knife on her. The foster mother is put in this agonizing situation where she's worried about the safety of the foster child, her own child, and herself. In the confusion, she lets go of the foster child. Anka Hill drags the child away, who's extremely distressed, and bundles them into a car.
To prevent the mother from giving chase, Wong slashes the tires of the car with the knife, gets into the car, and they drive away.
The getaway car speeds off the island of Anglesey over the Menai Strait.
Once on the mainland, phase 2 of the plan begins.
There is a second vehicle waiting, ready to spirit the kidnapped gang to the south of England. What the team does in the handover is wipe down the first car to remove any forensic evidence. What happens then is that the team enters into a second car, a Ford Galaxy, that then starts making its journey south.
They're doing everything they can to evade detection. They've got clothes hanging up in the windows so that nobody can see the child. The kid is huddled down in the footwell of the car, surrounded by these adults.
By now, the alarm has been raised by the foster mother, and the police are on the hunt for the snatched child.
Just over one of the bridges leading out of Anglesey into mainland Wales, there is a pub called the Antelope, and its car park offers a vantage point over the bridge. 2 lookouts are positioned in this car park to keep an eye out for any police. The 2 lookouts, Jane Going Hill and Robert Frith, are discovered by police in the pub car park.
With the lookouts apprehended by police, the remaining members of the gang are now heading at speed towards the south of England.
Anka Hill is already known to the police for the earlier failed kidnapping attempt, and detectives who act with incredible speed and professionalism are able to work out what the number plate is of the Ford Galaxy that is currently speeding south with the intention to leave England and make it to Germany, where Anchor Hill is from.
They drive for about 4.5 hours. They get as far as Newport Pagnell near Milton Keynes.
The police have used automatic number plate recognition technology to track the car, so they know exactly where it is. The police, using a 3-car box maneuver, are able to slow and eventually stop the car. The child is recovered.
With the kidnap foiled, the gang is arrested, and in 2021, the case goes to trial.
Some of them plead guilty, most of them plead not guilty. Wilfred Wong, his original defense is that he was on a walking holiday, and he had happened to have found a knife and a balaclava and a bunch of cable ties whilst he was out walking.
Wilfred Wong's story at trial changed. He altered his story, and although he'd never admitted to kidnapping, he did claim that he was trying to rescue this child from satanic ritual abuse and deliver him from a greater evil.
All 6 of them were found guilty and sentenced. Wilfred Wong was sentenced to 17 years in jail. Anchor Hill received 14.5 years in jail. Janet Stevenson received 15 years, and all of the others received sentences of between 4 and 8 years.
At the end of the trial, the judge eviscerated the defendants and said that they had taken extreme and unjustifiable actions in traumatizing this child. And for this, they were sentenced to some very hefty prison time.
Despite the gang's arrest, the satanic ritual abuse scandal is far from over. In 2021, Wilfred Wong was jailed for his part in the kidnap of a child that he and his followers wrongly claim was the victim of satanic ritual abuse. But the hysteria that he created hasn't died down. In fact, there are many who see him and his followers, convicted child snatchers, as heroes.
Wilfred Wong is no longer able to reach the huge audiences now he's in prison. But his status as a martyr for the cause remains undimmed. He has attracted a hardcore fan base who think that he was doing the Lord's work by taking on these Satanists and putting his life on the line for it. And he has motivated some fans to visit his prison and pray outside of it for his deliverance.
The judge in the case has even asked police to remove Wong's content from the internet. But that's easier said than done, because on social media, claims of satanic ritual abuse are spreading like wildfire.
New York City, do not let them normalize pedophilia.
Clearly, the conspiracy theories are still out there. So honestly, it was pre-internet. Now these things are magnified 1,000 a million-fold.
We have the Hampstead case in Britain starting in 2014, and Pizzagate in the US in 2016, which of course leads directly onto QAnon.
In 2016, a Twitter account published false claims that presidential nominee Hillary Clinton was involved in a satanic child trafficking ring run out of a Washington pizza restaurant. Suddenly, pizza companies across the US were being attacked by people claiming they were involved in satanic abuse. By 2020, videos about the rumours had been viewed more than 80 million times. These crazy claims would influence the social media cult QAnon, which would accuse Washington politicians of harvesting the blood of children in order to create an elixir of life that would help them stay young.
Joe Biden needs children, so do the Democrats. The head of the DNC is a pedophile.
Supporters of the cult stormed the Capitol building in January 2021, believing they would find evidence of satanic abuse. They found nothing.
How come nobody says shit? How about the people that don't say shit are the ones that are trafficking the children?
Instead, they looked for hidden messages and number puzzles that would prove the conspiracies. A TikTok user claimed that a video of Justin Bieber touching his hand was proof that he'd been trafficked as a child.
There is a small but very busy network of satanic ritual abuse activists who see themselves as warriors in the fight against the greatest evil the world has ever known. And they protest outside council buildings, social services. Despite a total lack of evidence, this group is continuing to operate and alarmingly considering whether to recreate Wilfred Wong's kidnap attempt on other children.
What are the lessons? Well, the lessons are, don't believe everything you hear, look for evidence, take a calm and collected approach to things, don't rush into judgment, do thorough research, be aware of how things can go horribly wrong and moral panics can take over. If you get caught up in hysteria, you can end up doing massive injustice and cause the most terrible mayhem in society.
People have asked me, can satanic ritual abuse happen? And the answer is, of course it can happen. Any kind of abuse can happen. And I'm sure that satanic ritual abuse does happen. So, we can't assume that any allegation of satanic ritual abuse is fictitious, and we've got to investigate it. But there's a big difference between that and recognising that and, the whole armies of people online who are kind of alleging this huge satanic ritual abuse conspiracy, in America involving politicians and that kind of thing. That is mad. That is not happening, and we need to be clear about that.
As in many other ways, we need to learn the lessons of history. And if you forget history, then it will repeat itself.
On My5, dramatic inside stories of people facing trial for serious crimes they were alleged to have committed, and accused guilty or innocent. Stream now on My5. Next, the 5 mistakes that caught the killer of Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman.